Great. So I think we shouldn't wait because there are already many participants who have joined our session for today. Welcome everybody to our webinar on what has COVID-19 taught us, build back better in the era of sustainable development. And what does this mean? So we'll hear from our panelists on what is their vision to build back better, keeping sustainability as the lens. I am the Director of Education at the Center for Sustainable Development at the Earth Institute. And I will be the moderator for today's session along with my colleague Carine. CSD, Center for Sustainable Development, conducts a lot of applied research on various dimensions of sustainable development and its interlinkages. And just to give a background for people who are not familiar with the Earth Institute, this event is hosted by the Earth Institute. It's one of the largest institutes at Columbia University. We have around 30 centers like Center for Sustainable Development. There are many more centers at the Institute, and we have around 800 scholars working on various different areas, especially on climate change, urban development, resilience, environment, many different aspects on environment. And today's session will be focusing on education. But since the Earth Institute focuses a lot on sustainability and has that lens, sustainable development, across various different centers and work, we thought that this would be an ideal place to focus on building back better with the sustainable development as the lens. Just want to remind us of the objectives for today's panel and discussion. We feel that memories are very short, and soon after the pandemic is over, we will forget the environmental causes that led to this pandemic. And so Carine and I are hoping that we will come up with a plan not to just remember the environmental causes of the pandemic, but also to correct our ways of living and have sustainability right up front and center. Many people, including the economists, are focusing on zero carbon emission future. There's also all the experts who are basically saying that the carbon emission had actually plummeted during COVID-19, but now that we are getting back to track, carbon emission are seen to increase. And my director for the center, Jeffrey Sachs, and along with many other economists have sent out many analysis on how do we build a zero carbon emission for the future and how do we build a better world again. And so the economists are thinking of economic structures for a green economy. This panel will focus on what is the education world thinking of. How do we build a green economy with education as the focus? How do we reprioritize the planet and its need? And how can we change education at all levels to remind people of what the global priorities should be when we build back better? And our hope, Carine and I are planning to have some sort of a statement or a perspective on the proceedings of this panel that can go along with our education and sustainable environment SIG as we go forward with CIES. So with that framework, I'll ask my colleague to actually do an introduction about the SIG and then follow up. Carine?
Thank you so much, Radhika. Thank you for this introduction. And my name is Carine Verschueren. Welcome, everyone. I'm a doctoral candidate at Teachers College, Columbia University in New York. And my research centers around district-wide policies of environmental and sustainability education in elementary and secondary schools. I'm also part of the Center for Sustainable Futures at Teachers College. I'll make a shameless plug here, under the leadership of Dr. Oren Pismoni-Levy, with a focus on teacher training and interdisciplinary approaches. So as Radhika said, the workshop today is initiated and sponsored by the Environmental and Sustainability Education Special Interest Group, or the ESE-SIG, of the Comparative and International Education Society, or CIES. So this group promotes scholarly research and professional activities of those concerned with the intersection of education, broadly defined, and sustainable development. And the SIG was founded in 2009, 2010, with the support of the late Dr. Victor Kobayashi from the University of Hawaii, who spoke of environmental degradation as one of the furies of this world, or global predicaments. And he called for a revolution in comparative education that highlights the interconnectedness of life in the study and practice of education. And so a decade later, Radhika and I, as current chair and program chair of the SIG, really hope to build on the work of researchers and practitioners alike and connect people to think and rethink and bring this revolution about. So that said, I also have the pleasure today of introducing the current president of the Comparative and International Education Society, Dr. Iveta Silova. Dr. Silova, or Iveta, is a professor and director of the Center for Advanced Studies in Global Education at Mary Lou Teachers College at Arizona State University. And she got up really early to be with us today. So upon becoming the current president of CIES, Iveta has immediately demonstrated her support for the work that Radhika and I are trying to do. And so we're delighted to have this validation from her and from CIES, and delighted to have her here today as well to make a few opening remarks. Before I hand it over to Iveta, just a few housekeeping details for the participants. You've all been muted, but you have two buttons at the bottom. You have the chat button and the Q&A button. If at any point in time you want to send a question for one of our panelists, please send it in the Q&A button. If you have some technical issue, send it through the chat button. And without further ado now, Iveta, the floor is all yours. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Carine and Radhika, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone who has joined us today. And thank you again for the organizers for inviting me to join this important conversation and also join this amazing group of colleagues. I would like to start my remarks by placing education in a broader context, and that is the context where everything and everyone, both human and non-human, more than human, are deeply interconnected. And while I think about it on a daily basis, yesterday there was just yet another reminder and another wake-up call when the UN released its latest Global Biodiversity Outlook report. This report reviews our progress on a global strategic plan to limit the damage inflicted on the natural world, a strategic plan which was adopted in 2010, 10 years ago, and signed by 190 member states of the UN's Convention on the Biological Diversity. And the plan included 20 objectives, which range from phasing out fossil fuel subsidies and limiting habitat loss to protecting fish stocks and raising people's awareness about sustainable lifestyle. So target 1, just as an example, aimed to ensure that by 2020, at the latest, people are aware of the values of biodiversity and the steps they can take to conserve and use it sustainably. Target 17 aimed to ensure that by 2015, each party has developed, adopted, and began implementing an effective, participatory, and updated national diversity strategy and action plan. Other targets aimed at ensuring traditional indigenous knowledges about sustainable living are respected and integrated into national planning, that pollution is brought to levels that avoid the ecosystem collapse, and the extinction of known threatened species is prevented by 2020. And then yesterday, when the Global Biodiversity Outlook report was released by the UN, we learned a very grim verdict. Not one of these goals and targets would be met by 2020, not a single one. And a quick reflection on our current situation puts this reality into very stark perspective. We are in the middle of planetary emergency, and not only a health emergency, obviously, but also an environmental and an existential emergency. And we are clearly failing to respond appropriately to a cascading wave of crisis that is unfolding around us, and in fact, that is systematically triggered by us, by humans, or maybe more precisely by a particular subset of the human population. And in this context, we need not just to build back, as Carine and Radhika so well framed it, but we do need to build back better. And I really applaud this webinar organizers for framing the discussion in this way. We absolutely cannot build back to the existing status quo. We need to build back better and in radically new ways. But what does this mean for education? So I will make three very quick points or provocations or invitations for discussion, and then leave it at that. So the first point is that education is deeply implicated in the planetary crisis that we face. Despite efforts stemming from the UN Decade of Education for Sustainable Development, schools and higher education institutions continue to prioritize workforce supply for economic growth over environmental sustainability. And in this face of sobering scientific evidence of a climate crisis, the business as usual of education is really not acceptable any longer. We must build back better, which entails a radical rethinking of the purpose of education, including delinking it from the logic of economic growth and challenging the unequal global power relations that drive reckless profit accumulation. The second point is that we cannot continue to operate within the same education framework and logic. The fact that the world is the most educated it has ever been, yet is the nearest to the ecological breakdown, is also a reminder that more of the same kind of education will not help us. It will only compound our problems. That is, broader access to quality education, along with improved cognitive knowledge in environmental sciences, will not automatically translate into higher awareness of global climate crisis or into the behavior change. It's not difficult to predict that we will most likely fail to meet the SDGs by 2032, just as we have failed to meet other goals that we have set for ourselves in the past. To be sure, we may make some progress on raising literacy and numeracy targets into which we are putting so many resources and efforts, but what difference does it make in the larger scheme of things when we are failing to learn to live sustainably and to survive well together on a damaged planet? And the third point is that while recognizing the importance of increasing access to quality education, it is necessary to simultaneously examine the underpinning assumptions of the current dominant education paradigm and the culture within which it operates. That is the culture that's rooted in the ideas of human exceptionalism and neoliberal individualism. Education can contribute, I believe, to a radical cultural shift towards environmental sustainability by reorienting teaching and learning from the notions of human exceptionalism towards more reciprocal and interdependent relationship with the earth and all of its inhabitants, both human and more than human. And that means that we need to build back better. We need to realign our research agendas and priorities. We need to transform our pedagogies and curricula. And we need to reformulate education policy frameworks to prioritize intergenerational and environmental justice over reckless economic growth and development. So once again, I would like to thank the organizers for mobilizing us as an academic and professional community to respond to this urgent set of crises and challenges, and to place education so centrally in the middle of it as well. So I look forward to today's discussions and even more so to the actions that would follow afterwards. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Iveta. I think you really laid the foundation of where we want to go and what are those three things that we want to highlight or look at. So thanks for actually stating that education is the front piece and piece of the sustainability puzzle, and we should be looking at radical ways of working through education to have a much more sustainable future. So thanks, Iveta, for your enlightening conversations and ideas. Moving on, taking that framework that Iveta has just stated for us, just to introduce the panelists now. We have Professor William Gaudelli from Lehigh University. He is a Dean and Professor of College of Education and has his career spans more than 30 years as a classroom teacher, researcher, professor, and a seasoned administrator. A prominent international scholar, his research area focuses on global citizenship, education, and teacher education and development. So welcome, Professor Gaudelli. Thanks for being here. We also have Christina Kwauk from the Center for Universal Education. Christina is a fellow in the Center for Universal Education at Brookings Institution. Her current research focuses on gender equality in education and climate change and 21st century skills and youth empowerment. We also have Alexander Leicht from UNESCO. He's the Chief Section of Education for Sustainable Development, Division of Peace and Sustainable Development Education Sector at UNESCO, and clearly is heading the UNESCO's vision on sustainable development. So thank you all. We are expecting one more panelist to join very soon from India. But I think since time is of essence, let's continue with our with the panelists that are on. I'll ask Carine to ask questions to the panelists in the meantime.
Thanks, Radhika. So my first questions go to Dr. Gaudelli or Bill. Bill, you are a well-renowned scholar of global citizen education. Would you remind the participants first what the connection is between global citizenship education and education for sustainable development?
Sure. Thank you, Carine, and thank you all for hosting this panel. It's a really important time to be focusing on these issues, obviously, given the midst of the pandemic. So I begin with global citizenship education as a discourse and a practice that takes as its root and foundational sort of wellspring of the interdependence of life on the biosphere. And this is exactly what Iveta was just talking about. That the condition of life on the planet, though we often think of it as disconnected, alienated, and individualized, in fact, it is highly interdependent, and it is imperiled as a result of significant global problems, the pandemic and global warming as two sort of front and center problems that we're dealing with today. This contents, let's say, is enacted through a constructivist or an experiential pedagogy that aims to deepen students' knowledge of the world and then to activate them to be citizens in that world, to be participants in the decisions that are made about how to make a better future in light of the problems that we have inherited. So in a broad frame, I think that's what it entails. To your question about empathy, I really struggled with the question. Also to Iveta's point, I'm not sure it's enough. I do think it's important to have empathy, very important, and it's elemental to global citizenship education. But I think there's a much larger kind of structural issue at play. That is schools, right? And so schools are deeply wedded to the neoliberal project of economic development. And as such, they have abided the kind of deep binary of the human world and the natural world being separate and apart. We know it's not true. You know, at every meal, we're reminded that it's not true if we allow ourselves to be reminded, and yet we abide that dualism. And so the big move I think we need to make, and this is a very challenging one, it's a long-term one, it's aspirational, we're not going to get there in the short term, right? We can't set a target by 2030 and expect people to reframe their view of the world, but we've got to recalibrate humanity's existence in the biosphere. That is front and center. And a lot of what schools do actually is more deeply embed that view that the resources and a dump, you know, essentially that the environment is a place where we get our resources and where we dump our remains. And that view is deeply baked into industrial capitalism. It doesn't work. We're seeing the sort of the effects of that now. And we have got to recalibrate and rethink it. So big picture, that's a move that we have to make. And I think empathy and global citizenship can help us to rethink that in light of the biosphere. And that's a way forward. So that's the first point I make. The second point I'd offer, and I related to that, I think much longer term, we've got to think in terms of sovereignty. And what does it mean to treat the biosphere with sovereignty? So I'm thinking about the work of Will Kymlicka, most recently in Zoopolis, where he talks about animal rights in a context of sovereignty for beings that are non-human species, sentient beings that are non-human species. One of the striking things in this book is that he cites 56 billion animals a year, non-human animals, are destroyed because of humanity. for a variety of reasons, to consume them, to use them, et cetera. So it's not to say that we can change that fundamental balance, but we've got to begin to inspect that balance and interrogate that balance, because it's clearly out of whack. I mean, we're watching what's happening on the West Coast. We've seen what's happened in Australia. We look at the roots of the pandemic and how it spread. I mean, very much this is connected to the biosphere. So how do we get to a place reconceptualizing the society that we've built within a biosphere that is limited, that is pushing back against humanity's incursions, that cannot sustain development in an unsustainable fashion? So I think that's the big picture. But we've got a more immediate challenge that I think it requires empathy, but it requires a lot more as well, which is we have an urgency to act now on climate change, right? And I don't need to tell most of the attendees of this session of this, but it's super important to begin to think about what does resiliency look like in this context. I'm thinking of the most recent work by Fumio Kagawa and David Selby in Sustainable Frontiers, which is a great organization to check out. They're very focused on resiliency. It's not about how can we stop the cataclysm. Much of it is underway. We've got to build resilient systems within it. And I think that's something we can take out of the post-pandemic world, which is to how do we confront a global crisis that knows no boundaries, that has deleterious and significant effects and terrible effects on the lives of people and society. And how do we do it in such a way that actually makes society better on the other end? So I see the pandemic as a kind of test run for what we're about to go through, which is, you know, climate change and the effects that that will have. So we need to give students a vocabulary to talk about this, the basic science that's involved in a zero carbon economy, energy and physics, land use and development, the issue with internally displaced people, refugees as a result of climate change. So all of that towards building resiliency. We also have to be partners across sectors. So K-12, university, health sectors, development, corporations, media, community-based orgs, et cetera, have to work together along with governments to address these problems. So it's not any entity that can do it. And we've got to educate about it, right? So we've got to follow the lead of youth because they're already leading in this direction. Fridays for the Future and Greta Thunberg is a great example of that. But we need to activate and encourage their leadership because it really is the world that they are inheriting that is fundamentally out of whack, right? And I think that goes back to the first point. So we've got to urgently act now in education, and we have to disrupt the way that we think about education as solely a tool of economic development. It has to be more than that. So I guess I'll stop there, but that's some initial thoughts on what I think is a really provocative question.
Thank you, Bill. And maybe a quick follow-up question. Citizenship education and global citizen education is delivered at times in a national curriculum. At times it's an elective in school districts, and at times it's offered by nonprofits in sort of non-formal education setting. In your opinion, what is the best way to actually bring this into schools, or what have you seen that is very effective?
I think it goes back to the issue of interdependence, that if we educate towards an awareness of interdependence and how truly suffused it is in all of our daily interactions, that is the sort of kernel or the nugget of the beginning of how we see ourselves as wound in much larger systems that in some ways are determining like what the options are in our lives, whether it's what kinds of coffee we drink or where we get our water from or how we fuel our homes or our cars or how we travel. All these pieces are kind of systems that we are embedded within. And the more that we develop an awareness of that, then I think gives you the sort of platform to think, how could this be otherwise? How could this change? So there needs to be an underscoring of the need. There's a why, right? And the cataclysm that we are now experiencing is part of the why. But there also needs to be a hope towards what to build to address that so that we don't have a system that just reinscribes it. And what I worry about in the pandemic is that there is such an economic loss that people are suffering right now. Not everyone, it's disproportional. Of course, the marginalized are being the most affected by it. But there's such an economic loss that the focus immediately after, whenever that after is, will be on recouping the economic losses. That is we've got to change that conversation. It has got to be addressing social injustices like an anti-racism stance, particularly in the United States and beyond. It's got to be addressing environmental sustainability. It's got to be addressing these issues rather than just making up lost time in the economy. I really worry that that's where we'll go sort of by default. That's not the answer. We've already seen that economic development alone will not lift all boats, right? We've got to deal with stratified injustices that exist within societies.
Thank you so much, Bill. I'll hand it back. I see our panelists from India joined us. Welcome so much, and I'll hand it back to Radhika. Now, if you have questions for Bill, please send them through the Q&A button and we can address them shortly. Thank you.
Thank you, Carine. Welcome to Mr. Jaivardhan Singh. So happy that he's been able to make it from India. He has served as a cabinet minister of urban development and housing in the Kamal Nath ministry, government of Madhya Pradesh. And I proudly say that that's my state in India. So I have all vested interest that Jaivardhan Singh is joining the panel. He is also the youngest cabinet minister in Madhya Pradesh in its history. So, Jaivardhan Singh, thanks for joining our panel today. We are very excited to have you back somewhat at Columbia University because we know that you are a Columbia University graduate, and more power to the CIPA MDP program and more power to you to join. To join government and to become a policy maker at such a young age. Just to let everyone know that every time I've met Mr. Singh, there are no less than 1,000 people waiting at his door, and it is a tough time. I don't know how he manages to meet everyone and address everyone's issues, and also knows everyone by their name in his constituency. So if you walk with him, he will know 1,000 people by their name. I don't know how he manages to do it, but thank you, Mr. Singh, for joining our call. And since I know time is precious and you need to also go back and you're joining from India, wanted to ask you two questions. One is, as a policymaker in India and as a person who has a lot of influence on people's perspective and minds, what are some of the concrete steps that you see governments can take to build back better, keeping planet in mind? And what are some of the local, state level interventions and policies that you put forward as the urban development minister in one of India's largest states? What were those challenges? What were some of those challenges? And how do you think education plays a role in urban development and other forms of sustainable development? So I know, long question, but I'm sure you have so many insights and eager to hear from you.
No, thank you so much, Radhika. I'm in the midst of an election, which is going on in our state. And I'll just switch the camera. So we have a large live audience of people from, from my constituency who are visiting me. So I've taken time off from them so that I can be part of this very esteemed panel, which you all have here. To start with, let me tell you that when the entire crisis of corona virus started, the first few months, people really didn't think that it would come so fast to India. And even though at that time we were, in power in the state, nationally we were in the opposition to the BJP government. And we kept saying that, India with a, population of over 1 billion, we should be a lot more controlled with our entire procedures, with our entire immigration policy at that point of time, to make sure that if people were coming in from the US, from Europe, from China at that point of time in January, February, we should have had a more thorough screening process, which, unfortunately, the government did not do. So what happened was that they waited until end of March to really, have a more stringent policy. And by that time, many people in the last 3 months had already entered the country. So what that led to was a complete lockdown, which happened, I think on March 22nd, and which went on for like 50 days. Now, as you know, India has a huge migrant labor population, and these people who, work on daily wages were stuck in, supposing the person is from, to give an example, in the US, if that person is from New York and he has gone to work on, $5 a day in California, suddenly there was a lockdown and he had no way of going back. He didn't have food. He didn't have, of course, since there was a lockdown, there was no factory or any work. So therefore, he was making no money. So there was this huge, I think millions of people who were just walking across the country on foot, distances of 1,000 miles, 1,000 kilometers, with no food, with no planning as to what to do with these people. So that's what really kept, the entire government occupied for the first few months. And, initially, I think till around June or July, the entire issue of COVID was centered in cities, your Delhi, Bombay, Calcutta, Bangalore, Hyderabad, where you had people coming in from abroad. And that's where the initial, cases started coming up. Of course, when the cases were less, we were able to screen them to a certain extent, were able to provide them good facilities. But now, as of today, when we're in September, what's really worrying for us is, of course, now we have the highest amount of cases per day, which is somewhere around 100,000 people per day. And I think every third case is from India. And what's worrying is that our hospitals, forget the small towns where I am currently. The bigger cities like Delhi, Indore, which is in my home state, Bhopal, which is in my home state, and even Bombay, for example, there aren't enough beds to, treat everyone. And also what's happening is that even though initially the entire crisis was in cities, it has now come to the villages, which is very worrying, because firstly in the villages, people are still scared as to, what is coronavirus, how does it impact you. I think Radhika made a very good point where you mentioned about the education level, or we could speak about the behavioral change which is needed in such a crisis. Because in India, even today, if someone in my constituency or in my city gets a fever, they won't go for a COVID test. They'll feel that, they can just put a drip, or they'll just have the usual fever medicine. They'll have a crocin, which we have in India, or a paracetamol, and they'll be fine. And you have to push them literally to even get a COVID test. So the government must work in being able to make people understand, that even if you test COVID positive, you could be asymptomatic. You don't have to have a serious lung issue or a breathing issue to be COVID positive. So if that awareness comes into people, that is not like, considered to be something which is, either wrong in society or should be explained to them as it's a new normal, that people will get COVID positive, but you should be able to learn to live with it and not get scared, not get paranoid. So the government must work towards creating this environment, which is not there really today, as of today. I mean, we are working towards it. I give an example. One colleague of mine, who is a member of the state parliament from my neighboring constituency, he was around 55, 60 years of age, and 12 people in his house tested positive. But even after that, when this colleague of mine saw his family being positive, he did not get himself tested. Then he got a viral, and he, of course, even then refused to get a test. Instead, got a drip put. Now, if you get a drip put, you feel probably fine for a day or two. And this happened to him for 3 or 4 days. And even after that, because he did not get himself tested of COVID, after a week, he couldn't breathe properly. And when he went to the hospital, then they said your lung is 75% damaged. And then we gave him, high oxygen support. Even then he couldn't manage, went on ventilator for a couple of days, but very unfortunately, he passed away yesterday morning. So that's the case of a member of the state parliament in our state, which really shows that in India currently, with a lack of awareness and with the lack of, I would say, infrastructure, we are still facing a very testing time in the country. Of course, what I try and do at my personal capacity, because yes, I was the minister, but then the government changed in our state, so I'm not the minister anymore, although I'm a member of the state parliament. So the issue we are raising in our state is that there must be more awareness in terms of using masks, in terms of keeping a hand sanitizer with yourself at every time you're meeting someone, and to make sure that there is some sort of physical distancing which is there, and also to ensure that the moment you get fever, or the moment you have shortness of breath, or the moment you feel that your oximeter level is below 94, one must get a COVID test done immediately. So that's what we are trying to do as of now. Was that enough?
Thank you so much, JV. I think you brought up this very interesting point that education is not just focusing on one sector. It has these interlinkages and with health. And clearly, this is the time where we are focusing on literacy, numeracy, yes, for sure. But how can we all be safe, and how can we interlink with the health sector and do the education that is required to build a better society, build a much more informed society. And there are a lot of research, I'm sure, will be on its way to see what kind of messages click with the public, what are things that can that needs to change. So thank you for highlighting that, and I hope you give have all the strength and all the commitment to, as you have shown over the past years, to continue with your great work, Mr. Singh. Really honored to have you as a part of the panel, and we will definitely keep you in the loop and send you our perspective once Carine and I have a chance to draft it.
Thank you. Thank you.
So over to Carine for questioning the other panelists.
Thank you, Radhika. We'll turn now to Dr. Kwauk or Christina. Christina, one of the emphasis of your research has been on girls' education, and in one of your opinion pieces, you've talked about girls' education as a solution to climate change. Two questions here. Could you elaborate a little bit on this? And two, how has girls' education been affected by the pandemic? And then in your opinion, what can we do to build back better?
Yes, no, thank you. Just putting myself off of mute. Thank you so much for the questions, Carine. And I want to echo our other panelists for, all of our great appreciation for organizing this panel, especially as we are, as Iveta said, in the midst of so much that's going wrong around us. And I think if we are able to start thinking about how can we transform our ways of thinking and being in the world, I think we will hopefully be so much more better. But as you mentioned, Carine, my work has been looking, or at least my entry point to this discussion has oftentimes been in girls' education. And I start here because, one of the issues that I have found, rather interesting is how climate change and its impacts, its disproportionate and uneven impacts around the world is oftentimes most acutely felt by girls and women around the world, especially girls and women in the most economically marginalized situations. And so when we see how, what we are experiencing today as this sort of educational disruption in a time of COVID is an everyday experience for marginalized girls and out-of-school girls around the world. So what we are, having the opportunity to critically engage, this is, an everyday experience for many millions around the world. And so I think when we think about girls' education as this entry point, we begin to understand how inequities and inequalities in our most basic social structures put at risk and, create these uneven opportunities, and we're all experiencing this today in our present crisis. In terms of kind of what we see today in girls' education, I think we look at the distance learning and the online learning agendas, and we see that 90% of countries, high-income countries around the world, are using these kinds of remote learning technologies. And then when you look at low-income countries, it's 25% at least, or below 25% of countries around low-income countries around the world are using these kinds of technologies. And you immediately can see the disparities in opportunities of learning. And when we think about girls, even more in those conditions, have even less access to technology, less access to internet, less access to mobile devices. And so in these sort of low tech or no tech circumstances, how are we ensuring that they have the access to continue to learn at this time? And so when we look at girls' education and climate change, this is just a beginning of continued crises for them. I think when it comes to quality education and girls' education, we see also that if we're attending to quality education, we're trying to target the same kinds of values that would enable us to have a more transformative education for all. So with a quality education, we want to understand, how do we recognize issues of power and power inequalities? How do we understand, like Bill was saying earlier, just begin to question the basic things around us and try to understand, what is kind of structuring our existence and our experiences. So if you're looking at quality education, it's so much about trying to understand what the purpose is and what the underlying values are. I think Iveta had mentioned at the beginning, we really, and the panel, this whole purpose of this panel is really around building back better. But if we look at other frameworks for understanding our current conditions, maybe we can draw on, for example, Stephen Sterling's sort of framework for understanding the three sort of orders of transformation, for example. And so perhaps it's a semantic issue, perhaps it will help us conceptualize a different way of thinking about our current structures. But building back better sort of creates this sort of conformitist and reformitist sort of understanding of our present situation. And perhaps if we consider building back differently, we can get at the alternative ways of being, alternative ways of being with each other that can really help us get into the more transformative kind of transformations that are needed.
Great, thank you, Christina. And maybe another question as, so you mentioned the quality education already and the necessary scrutiny of the education sector perpetuation of the status quo. And especially in formal education, you've called before for a more proactive role in policy and action for climate change education. But how has the pandemic complicated things?
Yeah, I think the pandemic certainly allows us to see that it's not one particular entry point for us to solve this crisis, and that is actually a whole system approach that's needed. When we think about the pandemic highlighting digital inequalities, we can't just look to tech issues as being our way of solving our inaccess to education. We have to look at the broader systematic issues that are also kind of structuring these. I think when we look at how when we look at perhaps even rethinking our scales of action. So if we want to look at how do we, so I'm so sorry for being inarticulate this morning, but if we think about the different scales of action and thinking about communities at a particular scale, potentially we can implement these solutions that are more focused on particular communities.
Thank you so much, Christina. Back to you, Radhika.
busy taking notes that I forgot that it is my turn. But I get to ask Alexander very difficult questions, which I really like because he's the person who has the right answers for all the difficult questions. So, Alexander, my first question, I'll ask both the questions together and so that you can manage your time. UNESCO has really been focusing on workshops and getting this education for sustainable development piece up and about and running with various different reports and various different discussions that you've been framing. So one of the things that I always find it hard to conceive is this idea of green skilling, and UNESCO has highlighted it in many different reports. Green skilling, definitely yes, that we need green skilling, but in terms of building back better in terms of like economic opportunities, but do we need to focus on skilling, or do we need to focus on a different mindset to bring back better, to make it much more holistic and make it much more mindset change? Do we require to, I want to use the word, brainwash people, or brainwash people like me who want to be sustainable but are not and want to have a much more sustainable life? So how does that conflict happens? What do you think of the conflict between green skilling and this change in mindset that we are asking to bring transformative education changes, as Christina has put forward? And my second question is on local applications of what UNESCO prescribes in terms of after COVID, before COVID, just on education for sustainable development. I wanted to know more in terms of what can a community do, what can a local, how can we shape local interventions to have much more of a sustainable mindset going forward.
Thank you very much, Radhika, and thanks very much for having me in this round here. I really appreciate it to be able to share a few remarks from the UNESCO perspective. I do have the feeling that most of what I want to say has been said already, so I hope I can still make a meaningful contribution. And I will start basically with really responding very, I hope specifically really to the first question that you had. I think it's a very interesting juxtaposition that you highlight between green skills and the wider mindset change. And my response, maybe predictably, is of course that we would argue that there is no real juxtaposition. Of course, we need both. Of course, we need very specific, sometimes also very technical skills to make sure that the economy becomes greener. But I also will say that, of course, there is a hierarchy between mindset change and green skills. And of course, we would argue, like you probably, that what really matters is the big mindset change, the real big transformation, towards a real new mindset and new actions really across the board, economy, society, and individual lives. And I was meaning really just to highlight some of the recent numbers, but Iveta already mentioned like the biodiversity report from yesterday, with which shows the dramatic really status that we are in. And then similar numbers, I mean, you are aware, come from the climate research, where the 5 warmest years have all occurred since 2015, and 9 of the 10 warmest years since 2005. So I mean, like we all know that it's really the pandemic is one thing, of course, and it's absolutely justified to focus our immediate responses to it. But we also need to see at the long-term processes that in a certain way are even much more dramatic, namely climate change and biodiversity loss. And against this background, of course, what is really needed is a massive transformation in all parts of society. And that's why we emphasize in how we approach education for sustainable development, really the whole spectrum of knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes that empowers people to be really sustainability change agents, and really to make a change in real life. I mean, that is really the ultimate goal of education for sustainable development, to effect change in real life, that's also why we work quite a lot around the different learning dimensions of cognitive, social, and emotional, and behavioral. We recently did a study where we looked at 10 countries' policy and curriculum documents, and we found a huge, even though the patterns vary greatly across countries, we found a huge imbalance. We found a huge imbalance between the cognitive, which is very well represented across curricula, but the behavioral learning dimension doesn't play a big role. And of course, one of the pushes we have to make is really enhancing the behavioral dimension, so that people learn really the relevant action competencies. And the new EST for 2030 framework, to which you also referred in the background to the workshop, we try to respond to the ambitions of the 2030 agenda and really make the link between education for sustainable development, and sort of the ambitions for a big transformation. We do address sort of the specific processes for individual transformation and what kind of pedagogies are needed to bring about this individual transformation. But equally, or even more so, and certainly more than in the past, we focus on the big structural, economic, and societal transformations that are necessary, and again, knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes for people that are necessary to bring about these big structural transformation. That includes, and that is also, we make that point stronger, I think, now than in the past, the skills that are needed to really take action in the political process and to really sort of influence the big the decisions about the big structural issues. Because of course we always have to be very careful that environmental education for sustainable development doesn't turn into something that focuses only on individual lifestyle change. I mean, that's an important part, but equally important are the big structural questions. It's I mean, like we are happy to see that at least sort of within the UNESCO universe, it is an increasingly sort of recognized field, as part of target 4.7 of SDG 4. But there is a huge amount of work to be done, and in the research that we did, a recent research of half our member states shows that there is a relatively strong policy commitment. I mean, these issues are integrated in some education policy documents and some sort of national laws, but there is a very big mismatch between the policy commitment and the practice level, because even in self-reporting exercises, member states themselves, only 17% of member states themselves say that these issues are properly integrated into teacher training, for example. So I think that's also something we need to respond to, this mismatch. And that leads me to the last couple of minutes I have to your second question, sort of about the practical implementation. And before I talk briefly about the local level, just to briefly outline sort of the matrix with which we look at creating action for education for sustainable development in this new framework that we have. We have what we call 5 action areas. And we believe sort of in all these areas, we need progress in order to properly change and transform education so that education itself becomes transformational. The first level is the policy sphere, where we need to create the enabling environment for education for sustainable development work on the ground. The second one is education institutions, where we emphasize sort of a holistic whole school or whole institution approach for sustainability. Educator and teacher training as the third area. Young people's activities, especially in non-formal education, through youth and youth advocacy groups, is the fourth big area. And the fifth area is really local community action, and in particular the responsibility that can be taken by local community organizations and also by city governments. And that leads me to maybe the two very sort of concrete examples that I brought. One comes from our network of UNESCO schools. We have a big network of UNESCO associated schools, around 11,000 schools across the world, which commit to sort of integrating UNESCO issues into their teaching and learning. And with a subset of those schools in a pilot project with around 250 schools, we implemented a whole school approach to climate change and reached out like this to 230,000 students and 14,000 teachers. And all these schools that participated really integrated climate change and sustainability in the various dimensions of the whole school approach. So into teaching and learning content, into pedagogies that moved from being sort of more cognitive centered on being action orientated, then also into the facility management of the school, energy efficiency issues, for example. Then in the way the school was the school is governed, it became much more participatory. A committee was set up of students, teachers, the administration, the leadership to work out a sustainability plan. And then the fifth dimension of this whole school approach, the outreach to the community and the collaboration with organizations based in the community. That there was out of these 11,000 schools, we were just with the funding that we had, we were just able to address 250 schools, but sort of the evaluations we received were positive, and we are now trying to really roll this out to the whole network of UNESCO schools. So this would be my first concrete example in the sense of implementing this whole school approach in individual schools, basically, where we also have the relevant guidance material in various languages available. And the second, maybe hopefully, or maybe even more concrete example is what city governments can do. There are many examples from across the world. For us, they come more from the UNESCO networks. There's a UNESCO network on learning cities. There's a UNESCO network on biosphere reserves. And one of these cities, Tongyong in the southern part of the Republic of Korea, a coastal city, has been particularly successful with regard to combining policy support at the local level with really mobilizing many stakeholders across the community. So facilitated by a supportive city government, which funded a coordination office, passed a law that enshrined ESD at the local level, and then also provided the necessary political advocacy. Leaders and community organizations brought together many different stakeholders, and they engaged in a wide range of activity in neighborhood development for sustainable development, and youth-led training for youth. An environmental education center was founded that now houses many of these trainings, and then also integration of ESD into community learning centers, and finally also into the local education policy, basically sort of in that part of education where in Korea the local level has sort of the say. This is just like one very in a way random but also very specific example of what can be done through a combination of community activism and also a supportive sort of policy sphere or city government. I'll stop here. Maybe I think one important point for these two examples, more like from the school level and then from the community level, I think is the multi-stakeholder dimension, really, where different stakeholders contribute with their strengths, and then also the very holistic approach to learning that goes much beyond schools and really turns education for sustainable development into a kind of whole of community, whole of society learning exercise. I see my time is up. I'll stop here maybe, and then maybe there's other questions to follow up. Thanks a lot, Radhika.
Thank you, Alexander. Just one clarification question. There's a question from one of our audience, Mark. He just wants to ask you to repeat the 5 aspects of practical implementation of education for sustainable development. Then we'll go over to the question answer round. But I thought this
right.
is
Right. Yeah, we're laying this out in much more detail in a roadmap document that we, as we call it, and will be online within a few weeks now, and that will sort of really lay out and explain also in detail these 5 areas: policy, education institutions, teachers/educators, youth, and then local communities. Those are the 5 areas. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alexander. Carine, or maybe you want to ask questions, or would you like to do that?
I'm good. I thought this was very great. We have a number of questions from the participants, and I'm wondering if we can tackle them now, Radhika.
Sounds good, Carine.
So there's the first question for Bill from Andy Smart, who's saying, thank you for your words. Can you say something about the connections between global citizenship and citizenship, especially in the context of ideas about curated knowledge and national cultural stories that are associated with E.D. Hirsch?
Great. Thank you, Andy. I'm glad I had my coffee. I would say that we all are citizens of belongings and affiliations at multiple levels. And yet, so whether it's to our families, our communities, our municipalities, states, regions, other structures that are political and legal, as well as to the species and to the biosphere. So it's not that there's any singular identity or singular affiliation that is dominant or we should think of as dominant. And yet very much in our schools, and you can look at the classic work of Eugene Weber on this about the turning peasants into Frenchmen, right? It's this idea of schools that inculcate states as the way to think of oneself as citizens. And probably most of us have adopted that view. And yet when we really think about it carefully, we realize that we're citizens at multiple levels simultaneously all the time, to institutions, let's say, right? I'm a citizen of Lehigh University. So when we think about it in those terms, then we can also sort of situate state citizenship as a privileged, right? And as the, I'd say, hegemonic or the dominant one of those citizenships. But we can also use our state citizenship to undo, right? And to create new sort of forms of citizenship. So we can use state citizenships, let's say, to press national leaders to join the Paris Agreement, or to rejoin, in our case, the Paris Agreement. So they are intersecting, they're not singular, and one is not dominant over the other, I would say. They all, they actuate on different levels depending on the situation. I think the last piece I'd add is that the tendency to view states and schools as wedded is something we've got to undo, right? It also needs a recalibration. So teaching kids that they're citizens at multiple levels, they have obligations at many levels, is a key piece of that. And I think to your quick question, a point about the mythos, right? So we create this kind of mythos, this knowledge that embeds an idea of state citizenship. And we're seeing that's collapsing, right? In some cases, like in the United States, we're seeing this sort of vision of the United States as an egalitarian society is clearly not squaring with the kind of racist legacy of the United States. So we're now coming to terms with how the mythos doesn't work, how it falls apart. We have a couple of choices. One is we can just prop up the mythos, or we can begin to really educate people about the problematic past that all states have, right? And that recognizing how multiple layers of citizenship allow us different venues to act as citizens on multiple levels all the time.
Thank you, Bill. I think that was fantastic. I just want to ask a follow-up question from Hein Shen, who's one of my colleagues at the Center for Sustainable Development. She is basically saying this is for Alexander, question on have there been further recommendations on how behavioral aspects of eco-education should be approached going forward to accompany the curriculum learnings, content, and teacher education? Or was the main finding that behavioral component is now absent and needs to be integrated? So Alexander, any thoughts on that?
Right. No, thank you very much for the question. There are a couple of emerging, let's say, recommendations in this particular study that I mentioned, where we looked at the different learning dimensions in different countries. One of the conclusions was indeed that the whole school approach that I also tried to very briefly explain is one particularly good way of implementing this more behavioral dimension of learning that we have laid out then as a recommendation sort of in some documents. And then we also have, in terms of concrete recommendations, we also have we issued a kind of guidance document what the important learning objectives from the cognitive, social, and emotional, and behavioral dimension are for the 17 are for all of the 17 SDGs, and this we accompanied with really suggestions for very specific teaching and learning approaches on the specific SDG that would really take seriously the need to enhance the behavioral dimension of learning. So that's what I can say. It refers to 2 specific documents that are readily available on our website. That's what we focused on when it comes to pedagogies, and what kind of recommendations for pedagogies can we give. Thanks.
Thanks, Alexander. Carine?
Thank you so much. We have another question here from Maria Garcia. And perhaps Iveta can answer that because it's with regards to the biodiversity report. So she writes, just want to share that after reading as well as the report on status of biodiversity and how we've miserably missed such a critical deadline to safeguard our biodiversity, talking about COVID-19 and once more this Anthropocene view on problems, we do not have problems, we are the problem, unfortunately. We as educators have the responsibility to lead our students to become critical and systemic thinkers and to start moving to a more ecocene view of things. Yet, do we have the time? How can be scared of COVID-19 and not be scared of, how can we be, and not be scared of the results of this report?
Thank you, Maria, for this reflection. And I agree wholeheartedly with you that we humans are one of the major problems of the current cascade of crisis that we are facing. And I think that's why education is so critical in reconfiguring our own position and relationship to other beings, living and non-living beings on Earth. And I think one of the, as many panelists here already mentioned today, I think one of the fundamental tasks is undoing this notion of human exceptionalism and neoliberal individualism that the education is built on. So, these are kind of the foundations of Western philosophy and kind of economic structures that we have built. And education has been probably one of the main engines driving this, institutionalizing this logic and socializing humans within this logic. And so I think that has to fundamentally change. We have to reposition ourselves as interdependent beings that are part of much larger community of living and non-living beings on Earth. And I believe that's probably one of the most fundamental tasks of education, but a really difficult one too, because there are so many interests at stake, including economic interests of various organizations, of states, agencies. So it will be a very difficult task, but an urgent one, and the one around which we need to mobilize as a community.
Thank you, Iveta, for tackling that question. Radhika, back to you.
One question for Christina, and I know, Christina, you and I have had many phone calls over COVID and are working on many things. So I just wanted to ask you your opinion on this ecofeminism. I think women are big drivers of environmental change, and we are a big voice. Not to dismiss the men in this panel, but just stating that at least in my community, I've seen that there's a lot of ecofeminism voice. But I don't know if you've thought of how do we enhance this voice further? How do we make it more collective? How do we make it more cohesive? Just coming randomly at you, just any thoughts that you have?
Yeah, I would definitely want to caution against assuming that women or female is the greener gender. I think that so much of that has been socialized within gender norms and social norms around how, you know, girls and women have to, from a very early age, are socialized and internalizing this notion that they need to think of others. And, you know, the sorts of roles that they play in society as a result of these gender norms, you know, really attune girls and women to really take into consideration, you know, the finiteness of resources, right? That there is an end to resources at some point, and one must need to conserve in order to have those resources for, you know, a rainy day, or to spread over a certain number of people. And these sorts of, you know, socialized norms and perspectives, I think, give us a clue into how we might, you know, transform our education systems to really thinking about how do we ensure that not just girls are sort of developing this intuition and these skills and these perspectives and outlooks, but rather all of our students are really attending to these kinds of, you know, perceptions, these sixth senses or something, you know. And so I think while girls and women right now seem to be having a really big moment, especially in the global spotlight around environmental issues and these sorts of things, you know, this is centuries of being socialized to see these things, and now alongside you know, this wave of increased agency and increased voice given with the Me Too movement and all these other sort of rise to really surface justice, I think just, you know, has really galvanized a lot of female voices in the public sphere. But it's something that, you know, we cannot ignore boys and men who also have this this worldview and this perspective. And it's really thinking, how do we use our understanding of these inequalities and these internalized social norms to really think about how do we transform and do education differently so that, you know, everyone is attuned to these kinds of things. So, I mean, yeah, I think, you know, there's a lot around ecofeminism that is really intriguing to look at and really to sort of celebrate today. But it should be an indication that we should all be sort of wearing an ecofeminist hat.
Thank you, Christina.
Thank you, Christina. And maybe a question that aligns with this one, and I may ask that to Bill. And it's a question from Rashmi Kwamri from Rutgers University. Thank you for organizing this amazing webinar. I have a question. Scholars of anti-racist education have highlighted that COVID-19 has not created the problems of inequality, but also intensified the existing ones. And so that builds on this idea that Christina just highlighted of inequalities. And when we say building back better, how do we incorporate or include policies that are not going back to what normal was? Bill, would you have any thoughts on this?
I think it's really typical, and I'm not saying we can't do it, but I'm just thinking about how we responded to the educational crisis, right? So we immediately fell back into, let's get back to cognition and instrumental approaches to cognition, rather than social, emotional, behavioral well-being as the whole child. So I'm not saying it can't be done, but I think we have to constantly remind ourselves in sessions like this that when we try to rethink something, it's very easy to fall back into sort of patterned ways of thinking about doing things. So in a sense, Rashmi, what you're asking is, how do we think new? How do we think freshly? How do we think, I'd like to say, the reason I say that we should lead with young people is that young people have the ability to experience the world more freshly than older people, right? And I say that as an older person who's in the company of a younger person, my son Alex, all the time. And what always strikes me about his views of the world is that he can see things more freshly than I can. It's the only way I can describe it. So we've got to, in some senses, rely heavily on our youth, our students, young people, to activate this rethinking. And that's not the way we think of problems. We think of older and wiser people, quote unquote, to solve the problems. But I think the challenge we have is we get rutted very easily into assuming the answer because we had another answer before. So that is the real challenge, is to rethink anew with fresh eyes the perspectives that got us in the binds that we're in. And so Alex's great point about, you know, how do we get out of this cognition box, right? Education is stuck in this cognition box. Of course, cognition is important, but we also know that we're whole beings, that we're social beings, that we're emotional beings, that we're also connected beings, right? So all of these other pieces and how we act in the world is just as important as how we think in the world. So all of these pieces have to sort of be recombined, and there's probably other essences that we're not even aware of that are in operation too. So I think that, you know, that's a big challenge. I don't have a good answer, but I know what the problem is, and that is, you know, letting adults always decide is part of the problem. So let kids decide. Let them help us guide the decisions about how we'll reset into a new.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that answer. We have time for one more question. It's hard to choose here, but I will, perhaps a question for Alexander from Stephanie Leicht. For one of the panelists, how do we shift away from the global testing culture that dominates schools around the world? After working in secondary schools in the US, it's very hard to move away from an emphasis on cognitive learning, knowing the pressures students and parents feel to get good test scores to open up post-secondary opportunities. How do we change the way we measure success and effectiveness of schools? And I think this is a brilliant question because in my research too, I find that there's a clash between two dominant trends in education system in the world, and that is one of testing and that one of educating for sustainable development.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for a very good question. It also builds on what Bill just was talking about. But like Bill, I also don't have the answer. I have to say, I think it is really the core. It is really the core question, and it really sort of it's one of the I think it's one of the main things that inhibits the further progress of education for sustainable development is the testing culture in schools, which of course you know, to a certain extent also has done in the right way certain justifications, but it certainly makes it much more difficult to implement this kind of education that really looks beyond what can be cognitively tested. And here I think it's very, I mean, like it's very difficult to propose, at least from our end, the one solution or the one answer. I think really here it is a question of affecting the relevant, the necessary political change, because I think it is very, very difficult. Of course, so individual teachers, at least sort of from what we see, of course, are able to sort of carve out their niches, you know, for proper collaborative education for sustainable development. But of course, there's only so much you can do really at the individual educator level when it comes to the testing culture. I think that's really a question to be answered at the level of the education system, and that's why I would again argue that this policy action area is so important. That it's so important to really at the level of national curriculum frameworks of of education policies to make the relevant change. I think there is a little bit of there is some reason for hope, I think, because even some of the organizations that really initially stood for like a hardcore testing culture and just not only sort of hardcore cognitive testing culture, but also narrowing that testing culture to really just numeracy and literacy and not much else. That even some of those organizations, I think, are developing projects and are exploring other ways of addressing or exploring projects of addressing themes that go much beyond what they originally tested. I think there is some reason for hope when I look at the sort of the discourse, for example, that is happening in OECD, which very much stands for the PISA study, but which also is doing very, very important work now recently on global competencies frameworks and a much more wider holistic learning framework that actually at UNESCO contributed to that initiative. Takes up some of the issues that we are concerned with in ESD. So there is some reason for hope that there is a certain process towards opening up the field, but it is a very, very tricky thing, and it will be with us. That challenge will be with us for another while, I'm afraid. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alexander. And thank you to the panelists, and thank you to the participants for being here today and attempting to address all of these very difficult questions that we don't always have the answers to, but we are thinking as hard as we can to rethink this and change this. And I'll try to summarize a couple of the ideas here and a couple of the perspectives that were presented here today. And I think all of the panelists really have strongly underlined the interconnectedness of life. And not only the need to do away with this duality of human life and the rest of the natural world, but also the interconnectedness of different sectors. And I think we've seen that in India also, that connection needed between health and education, and the connection between economic recovery and the need for more social justice and environmental sustainability. And I think that's really the core of the solution for a more sustainable world. So if Iveta pleaded to realign our research agendas and pedagogies and look for a different educational framework that does priorities living sustainably on a damaged planet, as she called it. And Bill, as an expert in global citizenship, urges to educate towards interdependence. And I thought that notion of that we're citizens at different levels is very important, and that we need to be aware of that and educate accordingly. That it goes from our personal life communities to sort of global responsibilities as global citizenship. Jaivardhan from India, in the midst of the Bhopal crisis, is really struggling with lack of awareness and infrastructure and that needed link for education between health and other sectors. Christina talked about the disparities the disparity in opportunities in learning for girls. And building back differently needs a systemic approach. And I thought that was very on point, is that you really need to look at the whole structure of the system and change that, and that there's a mismatch between policy and practice. And then Alexander pointed out, and I really love the 5 action areas that need progress. And I'll repeat them for people who wanted. There was one question about this: the policy sphere, the enabling environment, the whole school approach, the whole institution approach, much needed teacher training, and then focus on youth, non-formal education, and on local community action. And also the importance of cities, what cities actually can do, and that sort of interconnection between cities and their school system. And actually my research looks at that as well. Again, that whole interconnectedness is really, I think, the main theme going forward. And Radhika and I are so excited to be heading the special interest group, the Environmental Sustainability Education Special Interest Group. And I think our main focus also is on connecting people and creating that interconnectedness in the group and in the world, is that we all speak together, that we all think and rethink. And try to build back differently, as we've concluded. So again, many thanks to all the participants, many thanks to the panelists for sharing all their perspectives and their thoughts, and really appreciate and value your time. Hope you have a great rest of the day.